With Season 2 just around the corner, we at Maxroll have finally updated all of our tier lists for what we expect the best performing builds to be across a multitude of different spectrums. As the Necromancer class lead, I had to sit down with EchoHack and really go through what I think the true impact is, not only of the changes to the damage buckets, the potential for the new unique items in this game, which might I just tell you right now are absolutely busted, some interesting inclusions of some new aspects, as well as how every single build is going to react to all of these changes when you put them all back together. But I wanted to touch on the shifts in the different tier lists that we had, because I know a lot of people are expecting a lot of things, and quite frankly, from my own perspective, I'm trying to be a bit conservative. I'm not trying to overhype anything. I'm trying to be very realistic about why these builds are going to move up and down, and I want to break it down for people just so that you have some context. You can choose to disagree with the way that I'm evaluating things, but at the very least now you know why the changes happen, so you can better inform your opinion. Let's just very quickly talk about the things that I think are going to have the most impact across the board for the reason why all these different builds are either more or less powerful. What we ultimately need to understand as far as everything is concerned is that monsters are going to be easier to kill than they were previously, because character damage and power potential has also come down. If you are critical strike damage focused or vulnerable damage focused, which is the majority of builds, you're going to get hit a bit. Now, that being said, a lot of builds didn't necessarily rely on these damage stats or weren't as tied to them, so they have relatively come up in strength. And not only that, the builds which were underperforming previously also got some of the nastiest new unique items, so let's go ahead and jump into those. The first one that should be on your radar if it isn't already is the Banished Lord's Talisman, and while we don't know the stats on this necklace piece, the basic crux of it is you are going to be able to overpower more regularly for free. So builds that already could overpower with a guarantee have gained access to another source, or builds which could never overpower guaranteed now have a source of it. But the most important thing here, I think, to really capture on is the modifier of critical strike damage with overpower. Since overpower is now just an average damage bucket like critical strike and vulnerable, it means that people are going to be able to dip into it or focus on it more. And the amulet special ability says that when you critically strike on an overpower, you gain 120% multiplicative damage. That is an insane number of multiplicative damage to be put onto a generic unique item. And then builds which can choose to guaranteed overpower can now build into critical strike chance as well to gain access to this. So just the fact that you can do this, throw it onto builds that can already overpower, and now you have a much better synergy between critically striking and overpowering, means that you're going to see a lot of builds dipping into multiple buckets. And I think that this thing's multiplier is off the Richter scale for the potential of it. The second generic item here that we need to take a look at is Tybalt's Will. These are going to be pants that now give us 2 additional benefits that you normally couldn't get on a pants slot or an armor slot in general. The first one being that if you gain Unstoppable, you gain a 40% damage multiplier. That's fantastic. Considering the vampiric power metamorphosis says that you gain Unstoppable when you evade, it just means that every single time that you evade, you can choose to have 4 seconds of an additional 40% damage multiplier. On top of that, it says whenever you were to gain the Unstoppable status, you just gain 50 of your primary resource. So for shadow builds, whenever you go into Blood Mist and come out, you just gain 50 free resource and 4 seconds of a 40% damage multiplier. For builds that are continuously gaining Unstoppable, like Barbarians with shouts or Druids via their skills, you're just maintaining a much larger uptime of your total resource and getting a huge multiplier. I think these pants, again, unless they say like no survivability stats at all, are going to make their way onto a lot of different builds this season. And then probably the most impactful specifically for the Necromancer is X-Fall's Corroded Signet. This thing's nutty. Now let me explain how I think it works so you can kind of contextualize the impact that I expect from it. It says that your damage over time effects have up to a 50% lucky hit chance. Now when we use this type of verbiage, this effect, it typically means it can only occur once per cast of that skill. If we're to use another example of this, where I think the verbiage kind of lines up the same way, we have Crippling Darkness. Darkness skills have up to a 15% chance to stun. This isn't per damage instance, it's per cast. So if Darkness skills here is relaying it to the activation of an ability, then I think it's pretty safe to assume that damage over time will be similar. So if you were to use the Blood Soaked aspect to gain the shadow damage over time from Blood Mist, I think that means per target you have 1 opportunity of 50% chance to be able to trigger this. That being said, oddly enough, shadow builds on the Necromancer have a lot of sources of damage over time. whether it's Ultimate Shadow on Bone Storm or Blood Wave, just stacking Corpse Explosion itself using Blood Soaked like I said. Light's AoE damage trigger, the Sever Desecrated trigger off of the Boots of the Empty Tomb, triggering an additional massive amount of AoE instantaneous shadow damage. This type of damage which can crit, which obviously gets modified by vulnerable, which is a source of shadow damage for triggering Shadow Blight, and anything that says when you deal shadow damage, like counting up your blighted aspect. And then lastly, we have a really sneaky addition of an aspect, which I wasn't initially incredibly impressed with, but the more that I look at it, and the fact that it's an offensive aspect means that a lot of shadow builds, especially in the early game and transitioning into speed farming builds, gained access to another resource generation type that any other class just cannot gain access to. And now I could go over every single item, right? But oddly enough, we have taken into account every other change that has gone into this season. Now let's go ahead and look at the tier lists. And I'm not going to try to belabor the facts. I'm just going to give a quick overview of each build and then break down the nuances for when I go, you know what, I need to explain this a little bit further. Since we are talking about speed farming so much, let's start with the speed farming tier list. The concept of this tier list is basically how fast can you kill high value targets in the shortest amount of time and the most consistent amount of time, literally never stopping, only picking up items that are of value and just plowing through content. These are your Helltide builds. These are going to be your Blood Harvest builds. They're speed farming 50 to 80 nightmare dungeons. Anything that says I can be killing monsters continuously is going to work really well in this tier list. And because of that, movement speed is one of the biggest factors. So if we look at the tier list and we look at the S list, you'll realize there are no Necromancers here. One of the biggest limiting factors for the Necromancer is typically a setup to get a big payoff and our lack of mobility. And while we're not that much slower than everybody else, builds in the S tier can pretty consistently maintain the 200 movement speed cap. But Necro builds obviously still perform very well in these tasks for our ability to be able to generate a ton of damage over the widest areas possible. And because of that, you'll notice that the Blood Surge Necromancer has bumped up to the A tier. The changes to Overpower are obviously going to make every Overpower build that much better. And while I do think that the Blood Surge Necromancer is going to run into some clunkiness issues trying to manage the blood orb gain that it now needs to deal with to get as many overpower procs as possible in comparison to Blood Lance, which effectively does it for free, there's no way of overselling the power of Blood Surge to be able to deal damage in a massive area. And as long as you are overkilling monsters, maybe you don't need to be overpowering nearly as much, and you don't need to worry about blood orbs as much. Infamist, while becoming much stronger in this season than it ever has had previously, especially with the unique items that we just talked about, sadly hasn't gained any new speed. And while I do think that you can use a lidless wall setup to be able to like experience speed farm, the whole point of speed farming is to kill as many things as possible to get as many drops as possible. So any gameplay style that doesn't allow you to even pick up the gear that you're trying to get the loot from means that I think ultimately it doesn't bump up here. And then Bone Spear Necromancer, you notice that hasn't moved at all. And why is that? I don't think that Bone Spear Necromancer is just suddenly dead in the water. We have to remember the fact that Bone Spear Necromancer was the vast outlier when it came to damage output outside of the Mendeln, which was relying on a heinously bugged interaction with Bone Prison, which they have patched out. We'll talk a lot more about that later. But Bone Spear Necromancer was one-shotting most content in the game. And even if the worst case scenario is after everything, they've cut the Bone Spear Necromancer completely in half, that means it's now two-shotting most things in the game. In the B tier, we still have Sever and Blight Necromancer. I'm actually pointing towards Blight bumping up in this tier list now that I've spent more time theory crafting all of the builds. Sever, oddly enough, has gained the least amount of benefits from the changes because it was a crit build that wasn't 100% uptime on crit. It was a vulnerable build, and it doesn't output as many damage over time effects. That being said, it outputs a ton of damage. I do think that Blight might bump up here with Infamist into the A tier. And then obviously Bloodlance Necromancer, which has gained so much damage and the ability to output overpowers so much more consistently, means it doesn't have nearly as much wind-up time as it used to. So this also bumps up into the B tier. In the C tier, we have Shadow Summoner Necromancer. While it's gained a lot from the changes in this patch and ultimately minions do more damage, and please keep that in air quotes as strongly as possible here, Mendeln setups were crit, vuln, damage focused builds. I think they are losing a ton from this patch, and I don't think that the benefits to the minion damage is somehow going to magically offset that. And then similarly to that, In D tier, we have Pure Summoner and Bone Spirit Necromancer. Remember that our Pure Summoner Necromancer is trying to empower the minions of a Necromancer build as much as possible, and again, they have been buffed in this patch. I just don't think that it's enough, since minions also relied on a massive bonus from vulnerable damage and a massive bonus from critical strike damage, and now they also have been nerfed in that regard. And Bone Spirit, oddly enough, might actually bump up into the C tier. What I really need to do is get the Blood Artisan's Cuirass kind of machine gun setup back onto Bone Spirit in this season and see how well it functions in comparison to the other builds. Let's talk about the leveling tier list. This is actually a really nice little palette cleanser here, because oddly enough, Necromancers are incredibly good at leveling in this game. And not only that, they've only gotten better with the changes. So let's go ahead and focus in on them, and let's talk about why they are where they are. So in the S tier, we obviously have Blood Surge Necromancer, famously the strongest leveling build for being able to run the dopamine tunnels, because you walk in, press Blood Surge, and the entire screen dies. Now that being said, I do think that with the changes to Overpower, there's a very good chance that Blood Surge's overall damage output ends up being a bit lower than it used to previously, because you don't get as much without investment from Overpower as you previously did. Against that, we have Blight, CE, and Sever Necromancer still in S tier as well. Sever was already a phenomenal leveling build. It's gained access to another Essence Generation offensive aspect similar to Blight, so I think they definitely stay up here, because oddly enough, Corpse Explosion is real good when you just need to kill open world content and really high density and low dungeon content. Up into the A tier, we're actually going to bring up Summoner Sever Necromancer. This is a Sever Necro build that focuses more on the summons to be able to rely on them in their damage output. The minions have gotten better damage. Sever has better resource management. I think it makes sense to bump it up to A tier. I don't think it's nearly as good as focusing purely on Sever, especially when you do gain access to some of the more powerful aspects as you're leveling up, but it's obviously a very solid build. And then you'll notice that Bone Spear has actually come down. This almost has nothing to do with the damage nerfs on Bone Spear at all. Again, remember, it's probably going to be fine for damage output. It's the fact that Exposed Flesh, the best essence management resource for a Bone Spear Necromancer, is no longer going to be in the seasonal journey. It's also not in the Codex of Power, which means you need to go back to dropping it unless they've changed their inclusion of it. And what that basically rolls down to is the fact that it's just going to be harder for you to manage resources, and managing resources is one of the biggest things that slows down Necromancers while they're leveling. Now, there's a lot to talk about in the endgame tier list, because a lot of people have a ton of very strong opinions about the impact of everything that happened and is going to happen in Season 2. But just before we break into that, let's go ahead and take a look at today's sponsor. As many of you already know, we have partnered with Gamer Advantage, and while this could just be your typical ad spot, I'm actually incredibly excited to announce that this is mostly that they want to give you a free pair of glasses. Now, if you've been watching the streams for a while, I was wearing Gamer Advantage long before we had ever partnered together, because I just needed the extra protection from sitting in front of all these lights, computer screens, and scrolling on my phone checking analytics. Once I had gotten into my first pair of Gamer Advantage glasses, it was actually the Night's Inferno right here, I noticed an immediate reduction in all of my migraine symptoms. I just stopped having them. And not only that, my overall eye strain and pain had completely subsided. Now, this isn't just a story about me and my anecdotal evidence. I want to talk more so about the giveaway that we're doing here. As you can see, Gamer Advantage has a ton of glasses, frames, and styles. While I'm personally a huge fan of the Storm glasses that I'm currently wearing right now, not only did they release a new pair of Diablo frames, a sick aviator style, but they just recently released the Slay frames as well. A super chic, thin metal look on the face. As you can see, this dapper chapper right here. They look fantastically smart, amazing styles, and like I said, Gamer Advantage wants to get you into a pair of these glasses for free just for being a part of my community. In my public Discord server, which has a link down below if you would like to come join it, we're doing a survey. We want to see what people think are the coolest frames, because while I could just pick the frames that I'm wearing, maybe not everybody agrees with me. Maybe they don't think that they're absolutely the sexiest frames that have ever been put onto a human body. So I would like to see you in your opinion. Anytime between now and when I make the announcement shortly after the release of Season 2, I'm thinking by the end of the week, I'll update the channel here with information for when we're doing it. We're going to have a live giveaway at twitch.tv/MacroBioBoi. once we find the perfect frames that the community wants. As you can see right now, it looks like a ton of people are a huge fan of the classic Inferno frames here, but go make your voice heard. Follow the link in the description or come check out the Discord and follow the link there. Check out all of the different frames that Gamer Advantage has available and then vote on which one you think are the best. During the live giveaway, whoever is the lucky winner, I'll set up with Joel, my man at Gamer Advantage. The dude's an absolute legend, and we'll work through getting you the exact pair that you want in the exact color that you want and get them shipped out to you, all for free. Now, if you happen to not be the lucky winner, you can always use my promo code MACRO at checkout for an additional 10% off of your order. Full transparency, it obviously helps me out a ton, even just getting people to come check out the glasses. I know that we have holiday season right around the corner, and I have a lot of my friends who have been bugging me about getting the link code because they know that there's a gamer in their life that they want to get a pair for, who either has been having trouble sleeping, getting good rest, having eye strain issues, etc. But if you're looking to get into the pair of glasses that you see on my face right now, these are the ones that you're going to want to order. Yes, Gamer Advantage does prescription glasses as well. They have a whole little form that you can fill out so you can get the exact prescription needs that you have. You can order them without prescription glasses. I have 20/20 vision. I don't currently use these for my site, but all of the options are there for you. They have a ton of awesome kits for keeping them clean and up to date. They send them out in this nifty little case that keeps them completely protected for when you're traveling. I can't speak enough about Gamer Advantage. Thank you again so much for sponsoring this video, and I hope that you all check out the new Slay and Diablo frames and come participate in the giveaway so you can get your hands on a free pair. So let's go ahead and talk about the endgame tier list, because I think that this is where the majority of people are going to disagree with my assessment. But again, I'm trying to be a bit conservative. I'm not just trying to follow the hype, and I don't want to be selling anybody on a false promise that the changes in the season can't provide for them. I think most excitingly, we see two big changes in the overall builds that fall into this activity. Infinimist is going to bump up to S tier. I think that by and large, this build has gained the most overall power and the most new toys, and it's very easy to see a world where you can incorporate a ton of good speed farming kill speed. We have drastically increased our ability to deal damage against bosses and single targets. I don't think that the build currently has a weak point anymore, and that's why it's firmly bumped back up into the S tier. And then upsettingly, while I do agree with my previous assessment, it would be hard pressed for me to say that Bone Spear hasn't lost a lot in this patch, and we're going to bump it down to A tier. Now, that being said, if it turns out that just with a few key aspect changes or gear swaps, this thing continues to output the crazy amount of damage that we were seeing previously, it'll obviously bump back up into S tier. But I think realistically, it's easy to see why this build has lost so much and is probably not performing with the best builds in the game anymore. Bumping up into the A tier though, we have Blight, Corpse Explosion Necromancer, as well as Bloodlance Necromancer. Now, when you start talking about the different shadow builds, what is and isn't Infinimist? If I add on Blight, is it a Blight build, is it an Infinimist build? Gets really hard to talk about, but when we're talking about Infinimist, we are literally talking about Permanent Blood Mist and Corpse Explosion. That's like the Infinimist style. Then obviously you have Ultimate Shadow for Bone Storm as well. But when we're talking about Blight, Corpse Explosion, we are looking to use a core skill, which is going to change the stats that we're looking for. It's going to change our skill point distribution. It means we can't dip into as many passives as you normally would, since you need to drop so many ranks to be able to empower your core skill. But that being said, Blight Corpse Explosion is as close as you get to an Infinimist build, but with a spender, and that's obviously going to be incredibly powerful if Infinimist also bumped up. And then we also have the exciting news of Bloodlance bumping up into the A tier. The reason why Bloodlance, I think, is going to outperform Blood Surge, probably its closest relative and contemporary build path, is because it automates all of the things that now empower blood builds. With the changes to Rathma's Vigor, you now need to pick up blood orbs and have enough healing received percentage for them to add up and heal you for your base life. When you do that, it reduces the timer and makes you overpower more often. The reason why Bloodlance is so much better at doing this than Blood Surge is because it has the aspect Gore Quills. It says when you cast Bloodlance, it consumes blood orbs around you from all over the screen, triggers every single thing that says when you consume a blood orb, get you a ton of resource, get you cooldown reduction, get you overpower proc reduction, heals you, overheals you, can trigger Temerity Pants. It does everything for you while you're doing your damage. In the B tier, Blood Surge stays firmly in this spot. It was a good build. It should be more powerful now. I think it's going to be a little bit clunky to manage the blood orbs, like I've said before. So I don't see it moving at this point until somebody comes out with a version of this build that automates these same processes and gets the same amount of strength that Bloodlance does. Now you'll also notice that Shadow Summoner has bumped down to B tier. Again, The Shadow Summoner, especially the Infinimist Mendeln version of it, lost a ton of crit multiplier, it lost vulnerable multiplier, and while it's gained a lot of the toys that Shadow builds have, it has to spend a lot of its aspects to empower minions in a significant way. And I just don't think that actually empowering minions to do damage is going to net any good returns, even with the changes that they made in this season. Now, I am more than happy to be completely wrong about that assessment, but until I see otherwise, the math just doesn't play out for me. Bone Spirit Necromancer is still firmly in the C tier. It's an overall strong build. Oddly enough, with all the changes to crit, you might think it got completely slammed, but it was doing 20+ million damage long before the Barber Heart ever existed. So even if it's only now doing 10 million damage with a Bone Spirit, it's probably okay. Again, if you were to build the Blood Artisan's Cuirass form of it to automate a lot of your damage output, there's very much a world where this might bump up into B tier, depending on how strong it is. But we see 2 builds drop down into the C tier, which touch on the same issues that I just talked about. Pure Summoner, making the minions do a lot of damage isn't going to do anything. Mendeln got hit hard. That to me says it's just lost a lot of its power, on top of the fact that it can no longer rely on the bugged interaction with Bone Prison. So now it needs to proc Lucky Hit with normal stuff like Bone Spear or Blight. And at that point, I actually don't think that you're a pure summoner build. I think you're an awesome Bone Spear build that incorporated Mendeln, which is sick. It's super tops, and I'm excited to see what that looks like and how effective it is. But realistically, when people are thinking of pure minions, they're thinking of the minions doing the damage, and minions just don't do damage. Similarly, with Sever Necromancer dropping down in the overall endgame tier list, it just didn't gain as much from the other builds, and it lost a lot from its inability to rely on critical strike damage. So while I could see a world where Sever ends up just being another Infinimist build with Sever as the spender, I don't think that that's really what people are looking for in the fantasy of Sever, which was a shadow crit focused build that looked to do damage into small pockets of things and blow them up. Hopefully, I'm incorrect. Hopefully it hasn't lost as much as I think that it has, but until it can capitalize on things like X-Files Corroded Signet as effectively as the other shadow builds, I just can't imagine a world where it hasn't lost comparative power, so it puts it firmly into the C tier. So those are the tier lists. Those are the changes that we made. We're obviously going to be monitoring this very closely as build guides come out and theory crafting comes out and people play around with everything and discover stuff. We'll try to be at the forefront of making sure that all the tier lists and the build guides are representative of the new meta so that you are playing the best version of these builds as possible. Check us out at twitch.tv/MacroBioBoi. I'm going to be streaming as many hours as possible as I can for this season start because I think it's going to be absolutely lit. I want to try to farm for a Shaco as quick as I can off of Duriel just so I can salvage it, so I can make good on a promise I made way back in the preseason. So if you're excited to see something like that, come check us out. I'd love to have you there, even if it's just to ask questions about the builds, Necromancer stuff, the meta. I'm always happy to answer those questions. If I miss your comment, just at me. I promise you, I'm not ignoring you. There's just going to be a lot going on. As always, thank you so much for watching this video. If you haven't already, leave a like on the video. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you're new here. A ton of new people are coming back in with hype from season 2, so I'm so happy to have you all here. Leave a comment below if you agree with the tier list, if you want to tear me apart, if you think I'm an absolute godsend and I got everything right. Let me know. I'd love to hear your opinions because it turns out I don't know everything. I don't like to pretend like I am the end-all be-all of information, and if people have come up with like really good interactions or think that builds are being underrepresented or undersold, I'd truly love to hear from you. But as always, thank you for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.